Yesterday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent delivered a message to the government of Iran and to the world.
At the president's orders, we have raised the level even again, and watch this space for more announcements coming next week, because we are going to apply measures like have never been seen in the history of economic isolation on a country.
That is an execution of a policy that has been years in the making. And a week earlier, Bessent told you what it was.
The strait is never going back to the way it was, because the Iranians have used or tried to use it as a choke point. What we are going to see over the next 2 years, the strait's going to become irrelevant. It is going to become just another body of water.
This isn't just about Iran. It's about the end of a British choke point that's been used as a weapon in service of a policy which has kept the region in flames for decades. Now, if you're living in your social media feeds, you're probably getting whiplash. The straits are open, the straits are closed. America is winning, America is losing. That's not the story. It's a distraction from the real one. The real story is much bigger, and it didn't start 6 months ago. It started 50 years ago. And last month, a Lebanese diplomat blew the lid off that story. He named the names, and he did it at the empire's own Chatham House. I'm Susan Kokinda. I followed that story 50 years ago when few others did. So if you want to follow this, hit those like, subscribe, and share buttons so we can stay in touch and reach more people. Here's what I'm going to cover. First, what our Treasury and Energy Secretaries said about the end of that choke point. Second, the indictment delivered at Chatham House. And third, what President Trump is building to replace it. So start with Scott Bessent's comment again. The strait will never go back to the way it was. Energy Secretary Chris Wright described how that is already happening. In an interview with Fox News, Wright addressed the panic-mongering in the commentariat.
So you're saying that because of the U.S. military escorts and because some of these ships go dark going through the strait, that those numbers of these tracking agencies are not accurate?
Exactly. They're trying the best they can, but almost all of these ships have their AIS, their transponders are off. So they're dark, they're under escort. And it's a different shipping operation than we had before the conflict. But it's 8 or 9 million barrels a day on a running average are going through the strait. Plus, you've got to add the 6 million barrels a day that are being diverted via pipelines. And those pipelines are being expanded as well.
So the real gap is 5 to 6 million barrels, not the 15 million the doomsday commentators keep repeating. The interviewer kept hammering on the gotcha question. Who controls the strait right now? And Chris Wright flipped it from the tactical to the strategic.
But their ability to cause difficulties are declining. Our ability to escort and bring products out of that region is growing. They have sort of one card, and it's shrinking in size.
One shrinking card. That's not a choke point anymore. That's what Bessent meant when he forecast the future irrelevancy of the strait. But the situation on the ground in Hormuz is just one flank in the overall strategy. Economic isolation that Bessent spoke of is the final phase of a strategy that he's been carrying out since March 2025.
And we've been going after, as you said, their bank accounts, crypto wallets, assets around the world, cutting off payments into both the leadership in the regime and the government itself.
So while Treasury was quietly strangling the Iranian regime's economic networks, the U.S. was creating alternatives to the oil coming through the strait. Alternatives like uncorking our own energy production, like liberating Venezuela from Maduro so it could produce oil and augment U.S. capabilities, like creating a world where other Gulf states could liberate themselves from the status quo. The UAE walked away from the old OPEC quota system and start pumping more on its own terms. Iraq recently negotiated deals with U.S. companies to build pipelines, which will bypass the Strait of Hormuz permanently. That's the same 50 to 70% shift that Bessent flagged, and it's happening inside a 2-year window. Now, that doesn't even touch on the nuclear renaissance that this administration has unleashed. A big part of the empire's reliance on geopolitical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz has been its suppression of nuclear power, keeping the United States and other countries overly dependent on fossil fuels. Well, that anti-nuclear insanity is over, and the coming nuclear boom will vastly strengthen our energy independence. So, this is not a question of how many ships cross the Strait of Hormuz today. This is a reassertion of the basic principles of economic sovereignty and of ensuring that your nation is not at the mercy of an imperial overlord which manipulates chokeholds, controls insurance, and throttles your energy production. And this is how you look at what is happening from a strategic mountaintop and cut through the fog of war. That's what Promethean Action does every day, and that's what you will see if you subscribe to our free newsletter. The link is in the description. So, turning the Strait of Hormuz into an irrelevancy is the tactical side of this. But underneath that tactic sits a system built 50 years ago, and that system was put on stage recently. Last month, the British Empire's premier foreign policy outlet, Chatham House, convened a forum entitled The New Geopolitics of the Middle East. I don't think the hosts expected what happened, recorded in front of a live audience. The political advisor to the president of Lebanon, Mr. Jean Aziz, delivered a series of stunning statements speaking for his country right there on the empire's own turf. He began by describing the new potential for his nation. For the first time, he said, in what is perhaps exactly 50 years, Lebanon presents a new situation. Then he named the names of the people who put Lebanon on that 50-year path of destruction, which is finally being reversed. Mr. Aziz described how Henry Kissinger sent his envoy, Dean Brown, to, as Mr. Aziz put it, to manage the beginning of the war in Lebanon in 1976. Now listen carefully to this.
Brown telephoned his secretary only for the latter to tell him, forget about it. I found the solution. I will hand Lebanon to Hafiz al-Assad, and the Israelis are in agreement. And of course, the man was utterly mistaken. In the wake of that episode, Lebanon lived through half a century, since 1976 till now, a half a century of wars, battles, and instability, which ended by entangling Syria, Israel, Europe, the States, and above all, the IRGC regime of Tehran in a bloody quagmire.
You really have to let that sink in. Mr. Aziz was there speaking on behalf of the Lebanese government, reading a prepared statement that publicly indicted Henry Kissinger for the destruction of Lebanon and other countries and for the emergence of the IRGC. And he did it at Chatham House, the place where Henry Kissinger himself admitted, on the record in 1982, that he kept the British Foreign Office more closely informed than he kept the United States State Department. That's the indictment delivered out loud on their own stage in their own house. And in what world could a Lebanese official do that? A world in which the geopolitical grip of the empire is being broken by Donald Trump. Now, here's what's replacing it. Mr. Aziz was not reading from a geopolitical handbook. He was describing the changing situation on the ground in Lebanon. First, Hezbollah's paymaster, namely the IRGC, has been degraded by both epic and economic fury. And as Mr. Aziz said, the Lebanese leadership no longer has to capitulate. Second, he pointed to the change in Syria, which President Trump has cultivated. And finally, he said there is
a fundamental international change embodied in Western and particularly American attention to Lebanon, on attention at once serious and practical, and one congruent with our reading of the true nature of the crisis and the feasible solutions.
Particularly the Americans, as in Donald Trump's America, which is no longer operating off of the empire's Kissinger-implemented policy. Now, at that same Chatham House conference, the official from Qatar, Majed al-Ansari, dropped another bombshell on the hosts. He made clear that the Gulf states have torn up the playbook as well and are acting in their own interests as opposed to what he called extra-regional forces. And he did it by describing how the Gaza 20-point peace plan came about.
Gaza is a good example of this. How did we get to the 20-point plan? We got to the 20-point plan because 8 countries from the Arab and Muslim world came together, went to President Trump with a clear plan, put their weight behind it, went to Cairo, went to Sharm el-Sheikh, signed the deal, and are still continuing to work on a resolution. It was not delusional. It was not ambitious. It was very practical. And right now, while we are looking at a very severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we are still pushing for a practical, possible solution to the humanitarian crisis over there. We are looking through the lens of countries in the region rather than just waiting for somebody extra-regionally to come in and solve our crisis for us.
That regional deal that he describes, the October plan signed at Sharm el-Sheikh, is what became the Board of Peace, seated in Washington for its first meeting on February 19th, 2026. And who did Donald Trump take a jab at during the founding meeting?
And I said, Steve, how would you like to be Henry Kissinger Jr. that doesn't leak? And he said, are you a leaker, Steve? No, he didn't even know what the word meant, and it's true. I always say Henry Kissinger, who was one of the great leakers of all time, by the way, Richard Nixon said to him, Henry, who's leaking all this stuff? I don't know, Mr. President, it was Henry.
A typical, apparently offhand side comment by Donald Trump. But given what Mr. Aziz said about Henry Kissinger at Chatham House, do you think the Lebanese took it as a side comment? Do you think any official whose country and people have been ruined by perpetual war took it as a side comment? No, Donald Trump was telling anyone who listened that the Board of Peace and the people involved in it represent the opposite of the Kissinger model. Kissinger's system treated nations like pieces on a board, moved around, sacrificed whatever kept the balance of power intact for the men doing the moving. The Board of Peace and the Abraham Accords treat nations like builders, countries with a stake in their own prosperity and not chips in somebody else's game. That indictment at Chatham House wasn't an accident. It represents a new configuration of nations in the Middle East, telling the former game masters that their great game has been shut down, and it's been shut down by Donald Trump. Mr. Aziz didn't describe a policy mistake. He laid out how one man's phone call in 1976 produced 50 years of destruction. And the system that destruction served is now being dismantled. Bessent is cutting the money. Chris Wright is rerouting the energy. The Gulf states are building their own security instead of waiting for permission. And Lebanon just said the quiet part out loud from a stage in London for anybody paying attention. The system is being dismantled. Now, I'm going to close on a personal note. Today is August 15th, 2026. 55 years ago, Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold reserve standard and ended the Bretton Woods system. That is the day I joined a political movement which understood way back then what that meant, that America's sovereignty was under attack. Those of us who formed Promethean Action have been fighting to reverse that ever since. And with this administration, it is happening. So if you want to be a part of that, support Promethean Action in any way you can and join the fight to reverse it. This has been your Saturday Wrap. Thanks for watching.